newly released police documents in the Idaho murder case have given us the biggest clue so far about how law enforcement may be searching for the knife that was used to kill these 4 students. We also now definitively know that 2 reddish-brown stains that were taken for lab testing from Kohberger's apartment preliminarily tested positive for blood. Now, I sifted through 166 pages of these new documents, most of which just repeated information that we already knew about the investigation, but there were a few pretty fascinating, pretty telling tidbits that we weren't already aware of. Now, the bulk of these new details are about what was seized from suspect Bryan Kohberger's apartment and what wasn't. Police executed a search warrant on Kohberger's off-campus apartment on December 30th, a few hours after he was arrested at his parents' home in Pennsylvania. Now, cops wore body cameras. The entire search was filmed. So at trial, we are likely to see some or all of exactly how this played out. I don't know about you, but I'm fascinated by Bryan Kohberger, and I'm really curious to see how he lived. The 28-year-old lived alone in Pullman, Washington at the time. He rented a 2-bedroom apartment through Washington State University, where he was a PhD student and a teaching assistant. Now, I have been to this condo complex. It's really close to campus, but not really walkable. It was quiet and brawling. Now, Kohberger's home was on the 2nd floor here in this end unit. The whole place is pretty nondescript, as was apparently the inside. Kohberger's space sounded pretty bleak, to be honest. An investigator on the scene reported that the apartment was sparsely furnished and fairly empty of belongings. And something that stood out to me as being glaringly weird, for lack of a better word, he didn't have a shower curtain. Now, that could mean absolutely nothing, but it strikes me as definitely odd. Who hasn't seen a crime thriller where something nefarious was wrapped up in a shower curtain? But at least in these police documents, no one seemed alarmed by this. Once inside, crime scene investigators presumptively tested more than 50 items for blood. A screwdriver, a pizza cutter, a light switch, things like that. Really anything that had a dark brown or reddish stain. The vast majority of these things tested negative, but 2 spots in Kohberger's bedroom preliminarily tested positive. There were 2 reddish-brown stains on an uncased pillow from Kohberger's bed, and only one of them was tested. But when that came back positive, the item was taken into evidence and then sent to the lab, so both of them will likely be tested. There was also a brown, irregular drip stain found on a mattress pad. Now, this mattress pad sounded pretty gross. There were, quote, multiple stains on it. Now, like the pillow, this first stain they tested came back with an initial positive result. Now, when that was detected, investigators ended up bagging the whole thing and sent it off to the lab. Now, these stains will go through more rigorous testing to determine if they are, in fact, blood. And then that will be compared against the suspect's DNA, as well as the DNA profiles of the 4 victims. Obviously, if any of these are a match to the blood of Ethan Chapin, Maddie Mogen, Xana Carnota, or Kaylee Gonsalves, that will be a huge boon for the prosecution and a major hurdle for the defense. Kohberger's apartment was 2 bedrooms, but since it was leased through the university, he only leased one of those. He didn't have access to the other one. It was locked per WSU housing protocol, and investigators don't believe that Kohberger ever entered it. It seems that before leaving for his cross-country drive with his father at the end of the semester, Bryan Kohberger tidied up the place. Investigators noted that all of the trash cans had been emptied. Not too surprising. They also discovered a round padlock inside of a coat closet, and the key to that lock was found on his TV stand. Now, the lock belongs to one of the storage units available to the residents of the Steptoe apartments. Kohberger's unit G201 did have a storage closet assigned, and investigators found it with the door open and completely empty. When I read this, alarm bells started going off in my head. Bryan Kohberger may never have had anything in the storage closet, but something about the door being ajar and the area being empty just does not sit right with me. And it didn't sit right with investigators. In documents, an officer on the scene said that they believed the unit was, quote, likely accessed between the time of the murders and Kohberger's trip home to Pennsylvania, and more importantly, quote, It is also believed the storage closet could contain trace evidence. Police were so convinced of this hunch that they asked the judge to amend the search warrant so they could legally look through the storage closet. Unfortunately, police didn't collect any evidence because they noted there were cobwebs going into the closet and dust all over the floor, indicating to them that the unit hadn't been used recently. But what is recently? It might be different to you or me. You have to remember, this search was conducted 7 weeks after the murders. I don't know about you, but I know for me, my apartment gets a nice coat of dust settling down in just a few days when I'm cleaning it regularly, and that's with me and my family living in it. So I don't know. I believe there is more that can be learned from this storage unit, and it's plausible that this space was used to store items relating to the murders temporarily before they were disposed of. And if that happened in the immediate aftermath of the killings, that would give more than a month for dust to potentially settle and cobwebs to form. So I want to dive a little deeper into this theory, and a caveat here: Kohberger is charged with quadruple homicide and burglary, but he is innocent until proven guilty. So my theory is just that, a theory. A K-bar knife sheath was discovered at the crime scene, but the knife itself was not. It appears whomever the killer was took it with them when they left. And as far as we know, the clothes that the killer was wearing the night of the murders have never been found. The night of the killings, there's a gap in time between 4:20 a.m. and 4:48 a.m. where investigators are unsure of Brian Kohberger's alleged movements. At 4:20, CCTV footage near the crime scene captures a white car, which cops believe is Kohberger driving in his Hyundai Elantra, leaving the area at a high rate of speed. Now, the suspect's phone was off the grid all night, but at 4:48 a.m., it pings a tower south of Moscow, Idaho. Where it pings is in the middle of a sprawling farmland, which is pitch black at that time of night. One theory so far was that the killer may have discarded bloody clothes and the murder weapon along that route. But now knowing that he had access to a private storage closet makes me lean away from that theory. Police say there was a significant amount of blood at the scene, and it's likely that the perpetrator's clothes and shoes were covered in it. So along with the knife, the killer would have had to get rid of the clothes they were wearing at the time. It is not out of the realm of possibilities to think that the suspect would have taken them home with him and kept them hidden so that they could be disposed of later. Now, it is just speculation, but my gut tells me that the killer probably had a clean set of clothes in his car and changed out of the bloody ones somewhere along that dark rural road so he didn't return home covered in the blood of the victims on the off chance someone saw him. A perp, particularly one with extensive knowledge of the criminal justice system and law enforcement, would probably not want to keep those things, bloody clothes, a knife, in their home. So a padlocked storage closet is not a bad place. Now, there isn't any evidence that we know of that Kohberger kept anything in his storage unit or emptied it, but it's worth a deeper look. It's not clear if there are any security cameras in the storage area, but there are a bunch on the WSU campus. And we know this because they were utilized to track Brian Kohberger's movements on the night of the murders. If it were me, I would have been canvassing residents to see if the suspect was seen going in or out of the storage unit between the time of the killings and his arrest. And I would want to scour those nearby CCTV cameras to look for any time that white Hyundai Elantra was seen leaving his apartment during the same time frame to determine where he was going. It could lead investigators to potential places that the alleged murder weapon or those bloody clothes were discarded. And there's a good chance that this is exactly what law enforcement is already doing. And we won't know until the preliminary hearing. Moscow police have done a masterful job so far at not tipping their hand regarding this investigation. They may have found the clothes already, the murder weapon, or any number of damning pieces of evidence in the course of their investigation. So I am gearing up for a bombshell week in court next month. Despite the fact that the judge has issued a gag order in this case, this is a constantly evolving story, so make sure you are checking dailymail.com for the latest.
Kohberger displayed some suspicious behavior in the days leading up to his arrest.
The FBI watched Brian's every single move for 4 days straight before they were able to conclusively match DNA from the crime scene to Brian's DNA and then bust in the front door and arrest him. Law enforcement source has now revealed that Brian was seen thoroughly cleaning his white Hyundai top to bottom. This white Hyundai that police have very strong reason to believe was used in the commission of the crime. He was also seen wearing surgical gloves, like the kind that don't leave fingerprints, every time he left the house, including when he took out the trash at 4 a.m. that he then put in his neighbor's trash cans. So hypothetically, let's say Kohberger was putting his criminology and forensics classes to good use and allegedly covering up his tracks, and for good reason, because the FBI did in fact take that trash, which gave them the DNA to match Brian to the crime. Now, interestingly, some people who know Brian have described him as being a little OCD. So it's going to be something to watch as to whether or not his attorney is going to try to reason away the glove wearing and use that as an excuse. Now, Brian's behavior in Pennsylvania has been described as pretty meticulous, but that does seem at odds with some new information we're learning. Now, this was taken from a video of a vigil that was held for the victims of the Idaho massacre about 2 weeks after. And people believe this guy right here is Brian Kohberger. Okay, here's a closer shot. Yes, I know it is extremely blurry, but it is the best we have. The profile kind of looks like Brian's. I don't know. I think the hair might be too light. The vibe just doesn't feel like him. I don't know. Maybe it does look like him, but I pointed out in a previous video that if you don't think it looks like him at first glance, you have to remember his appearance drastically changes photo to photo. These are recent pictures of the same guy. And it's not uncommon for perpetrators to inject themselves into an investigation or help search for a missing person that they've abducted. Now, to be clear, Brian here is just an alleged killer. He has not been convicted. But what do you think? Here is some bizarre information about the man suspected of killing the IDAHO4, Brian Kohberger. He received his master's degree in criminal justice in May of this year, and as part of that, he did a research project. Kohberger was researching how emotions and psychological traits influence a person who is committing a crime. And we know he was looking into this because he put a call out on social media, this right here, looking for research participants. Kohberger specifically wanted to understand the thoughts and feelings throughout the experience of committing a crime. And people who knew him are now speaking out. He was described by a relative as being pretty odd and kind of militant about veganism. He was so obsessed with being vegan, they said, that he refused to eat food cooked in pots and pans that had previously cooked meat and made his relatives buy new ones. And one of his friends described him as kind of a down-to-earth guy in undergrad, but said that he underwent a significant personality change between junior and senior year. It was so bad that they actually started to cut him out of their friend group. Now, this former friend describes him as suddenly becoming very thin, very aggressive, taking up boxing, becoming a bit of a bully, and always itching for a fight. Now, this kind of firsthand information about this suspect could be very important, and law enforcement is asking the media to get the word out that if you know Brian Kohberger or have interacted with him in the past, call the tip line.
At 4, I'm Shira Matsuzawa. The case against Brian Kohberger is a mystery that doesn't seem to square with his image. And that is especially true to those who have been friends for years with the man now charged in the murders of 4 students at the University of Idaho. Chris Ingalls from our sister station, Seattle, continues his reports from Kohberger's home state of Pennsylvania.
It's a long way away, but this part of eastern Pennsylvania feels a deep connection with the Idaho College murders. That's because the suspect, Brian Kohberger, spent his teenage years here and most of his adult life before he moved to Washington State last summer. In December, people here were hit by a fact as cold and hard as steel, the once towering industry that fueled this part of Pennsylvania. One of their own was charged in a mass murder 2,500 miles away.
So I looked it up, I typed, Idaho murders, and then like, holy crap, that's Brian. That's Brian. I know Brian, It's wild to me. It's a shock, seeing someone you've known on TV.
Jack Bayless met Brian Kohberger in 8th grade. when the two of them ran with a group of boys in this neighborhood near Albrightsville, Pennsylvania.
I want to say he wanted to be a cop since he was younger.
What kind of teenager was he?
He was pretty normal. He was definitely heavier set, and that caused issues in school, apparently.
But in high school, dramatic changes washed over Kohberger, according to several friends, including Bayless.
I believe it was the weight loss first. And I was, I want to say 14 to maybe 16, between there was the big weight loss. I could be wrong on this, but I'm pretty sure that's what it was. And then it was the drugs.
How did he get started in drugs?
He got in drugs via an acquaintance of his. It was definitely heroin. It was pretty gnarly.
Bayless doesn't know exactly when Kohberger got clean.
Last I saw him, he was pretty lucid.
But the two reconnected after Kohberger enrolled at DeSales University in Center Valley, right around the corner from Bayless's home. Kohberger's major, criminology.
He's always been kind of fascinated with kind of how the brain works and how people think and why they do what they do.
And so my senior year, I ended up in a biology class, which is where I met and interacted with Brian Kohberger.
What were your first impressions of the guy?
Brian seemed normal enough.
But that opinion did not last for Bernard James, a DeSales film student in 2018 when he attended a class with Kohberger.
One of the big parts of that biology class that we were in, we had a group project as a part of our final grade.
With 4 DeSales classmates on the project, Kohberger was chosen as team leader. Not surprising for the student DeSales professor Michelle Bolger called brilliant and one of the best students ever, according to an article in the Daily Mail. Dr. Bolger declined to comment to King 5. But to some classmates at the Christian University, Kohberger seemed more like a know-it-all.
The way that he came across in his speech, kind of person who has to use big words, the one always raising his hand in class.
And what happened then towards the end of this whole thing?
We're approaching the due date, and I was feeling like I was left out to dry.
Bernard James says Kohberger completed the class project without including him, resulting in a failed class in Bernard's final year at DeSales. He confronted Kohberger in the university library.
I remember him being very straight-faced, very almost emotionless with this. He kind of a small smile on his face. Like there's more to him than it seems. Very intense stare. I remember that. I'll never forget that. Looking right into my soul almost, as we were having this back and forth. Manipulative, cold.
Was he witnessing an odd personality trait or something more? After Kohberger's arrest, Bernard can't be sure.
I mean, it's not every day you expect to come into contact with someone who's accused of something like that, but I see it in some ways. I see the calculated side of him.
We're talking about 4 vicious stabbings here.
Yeah.
Could your friend have done this?
I hope he didn't do it. I'm a big believer in innocent until proven guilty. So I hope someone I know didn't do that,
Here in Pennsylvania, we've been unable to reach anyone from Kohberger's family. A public defender here who represented him during extradition proceedings has said that Kohberger looks forward to being exonerated in Idaho.
I wanted to come in person to the crime scene on King Road in Moscow, Idaho at night, sort of eerily peaceful at this crime scene. This is an idea of what it would have looked like the night of the murders. The media circus has left. I am the only reporter here right now, and you can hear a pin drop out there.
Xana Kernodle, Ethan Chapin, Madison Mogan, and Kaylee Gonsalves were brutally stabbed to death in the middle of the night, and we still don't know why. What was the motive? Who was the target? Now, these are some of the biggest unanswered questions in the case of the IDAHO4, and I've waded through all of the information out there about the crime, the victims, and the suspected killer, Brian Kohberger, to piece together some answers. This attack was brutal. It was extremely violent, and it was personal. But why did the killer do it? Could the answer be as simple as a crime of passion? Well, just days after the murders, Brian Kohberger allegedly told his neighbor just that. Now, this was weeks before cops would zero in on him as their prime suspect. The neighbor told a CBS reporter that Kohberger brought up the murders in casual conversation and said, quote, "It seems like they have no leads, like it was a crime of passion." The 28-year-old PhD student has been described by those who know him as being pretty awkward, particularly with women. In the weeks since his arrest, only one ex has come forward, and the term ex is really an overstatement. These two went on an awkward first date many years ago, and that is as far as it went. And a brewery owner in Pennsylvania claims that Kohberger made his female employees and customers uncomfortable by pressing them with questions about their living situations and getting irritated when his advances were rebuffed. So we've got this picture of a guy who isn't great with women and may have had an axe to grind, particularly if one of the female victims turned him down or ignored him, which is my working theory. Plus, some experts think that the killer was satiating a sexual desire. None of the victims were sexually assaulted, and criminologist Dr. Casey Jordan believes that the murderer was supplementing the act of stabbing for the act of sex. Up to this point, none of the evidence that we are aware of reveals a direct link between the victims and the suspect. Kaylee's family said that they don't really recognize Kohberger at all, but they added that they are seeing connections between him and Kaylee. And sources say he followed all three of the female victims on social media. Now, a bunch of fake accounts have popped up on Instagram purporting to be him, but one account at crim.kohberger may actually be the real deal. A source with a connection to the investigation also came forward saying that the suspect allegedly messaged one of the girls repeatedly on Instagram and got no response. Now, the messages were described as being innocuous, just a, hey, how are ya? But they were ignored, which may have been interpreted as rejection. Even if Kohberger did follow the victims on Instagram, how he came across them in the first place is another piece of the mystery. Brian was new to the area, having moved to nearby Pullman, Washington in June of 2022 to begin his doctorate in criminology at Washington State University. WSU and the University of Idaho, where the victims were students, are just 10 miles apart with pretty much nothing but farmland in between. Moscow, Idaho is this really quaint, inviting, charming little town, while Pullman is just kind of cold by comparison. WSU students often go to Moscow to eat and shop and hang out and things like that. Kohberger is also a strict vegan. When I was staying in the area, I looked for vegan restaurants and there just weren't any. The best you could hope for are vegan menu options, and one of the first places that pops up when searching for that is the Mad Greek in Moscow, and that is where two of the victims, Maddie and Xana, worked. A former employee told People magazine that Kohberger came in more than once for a vegan pizza. Now, the owner of the Mad Greek swiftly denied that story, but the report also said that police are aware of the visits and took surveillance video from the area. From the get-go, police were convinced that these murders were targeted. Now, law enforcement never said who they believed the target was, but a lot of people think it was Kaylee Goncalves. Now, determining who was killed first could be the best indicator as to figuring out the killer's main target. And one of these surviving roommates told cops that she was awoken around 4 a.m. to noises coming from the third floor. Now, that is where Kaylee and Maddie were sleeping. At the time, she thought it was Kaylee playing with her dog, but then she heard one of the girls saying something chilling. Someone is here. The killer also dropped a knife sheath on the bed next to Maddie's body, so it's likely that this was the spot he first removed the murder weapon from the sheath. Now, the ferocity of Kaylee's wounds suggests two things. The first is that the majority of the killer's rage was directed at her, and the second is that she may have been the first kill when the murderer was at his strongest. Kaylee's dad has also pointed out, if those girls weren't a target, the killer would have had no reason to go up to the third floor. Xana and Ethan were found on the second floor, nearest to where cops think the murderer entered and exited. All of that points to the killer starting the stabbings on the third floor with Maddie and Kaylee. Now, DNA transfer from victim to victim will forensically determine the order of death, but that will not come out until trial. So if the third floor victims were the main target, why were Xana and Ethan also killed and two other roommates left alive and unharmed? Maddie, Kaylee, and Ethan were all killed in bed, but Xana was likely up and awake. She was on TikTok minutes before being stabbed to death, and she had defensive wounds, and her body, unlike the others, was found on the floor. The surviving roommate heard crying coming from Xana's room after the noises upstairs, and the killer, she said something to the effect of, "I'm going to help you." Prior to her death, Kaylee Gonsalves mentioned having a stalker. She was referring to two guys in particular who police found and cleared, neither of whom were Bryan Kohberger. But just because that lead didn't pan out doesn't mean that the victims weren't being stalked. According to law enforcement, the suspect's phone pinged in the area of the home 12 times in the months before the murders. And Kaylee's family said Kohberger allegedly got so close he connected to their Wi-Fi with his own phone. And this particular home at 1122 King Road is just an easy target. It's 3 floors, it has a really unique layout, and it's situated on a hill.
Where I'm standing is the vantage point that the alleged killer would have had if he parked back here, which is where the Hyundai was seen and what cops believe happened.
And depending on where you stand, you can see directly into every single window. Now, as I mentioned, the layout of the house is strange. The first floor has 2 bedrooms. The second floor also has 2 bedrooms, as well as the main living area, which is accessed by this sliding glass door in the back. There are also 2 bedrooms on the 3rd floor. The timeline of the murders has been narrowed down to less than 20 minutes between 4:04 a.m. and 4:20 a.m. Now, in order to get in, kill 4 people, and get out in that time frame with such a strange floor plan, the killer had to have had a solid idea of how this house was laid out. Now, this was a popular off-campus party house, and based on everything that I have learned and researched, it's plausible that the killer had been inside maybe more than once, just disguised as a partygoer. Law enforcement has searched high and low for the military-style K-bar knife that the suspected murderer used. It's a standard issue knife given to members of the Marine Corps. The sheath has this insignia of the military branch stamped on the side. The medical examiner confirmed that the victims died by multiple stab wounds by a fixed blade knife in the upper body and torso. Now, the sheath was dropped next to Maddie's body, and it contained the killer's DNA. Unfortunately, though, for investigators, the murder weapon didn't turn up at the crime scene or during a search of Kohberger's apartment and office on the WSU campus. Now, his white Hyundai Elantra was dissected by a forensics team as well, and it's possible, albeit unlikely, that the knife was recovered there, but the results of that search are currently under a gag order. Now, the route that police believe the alleged killer drove from the scene of the crime back home is this long, winding, roundabout journey through just pitch black, sprawling farmland.
This is the house behind me. It's a very sort of desolate, just residential area. It looks like it's the middle of the night here, but it is just about 6 p.m. and there is little to no foot traffic or cars coming down.
Kohberger and his father also drove cross-country in December from Washington to Pennsylvania, which would have provided ample opportunities to potentially discard a murder weapon. The next court date is a ways away, June 26th, but this hearing will lay out almost everything that the prosecution has on Kohberger, including a boatload of information we don't yet know about. The probable cause hearing usually happens within 2 weeks of arraignment, but Kohberger waived his right to a speedy trial. So in this case, the prosecution and the defense have roughly 5 months to prepare. When the date finally comes, both sides will present evidence and call witnesses so a judge can determine whether or not there is enough for this case to go to trial, and we expect it to. Now, as it stands right now, Bryan Kohberger is facing 4 counts of first-degree murder and felony burglary, and he hasn't yet entered a plea. To Washington State University in June of 2022 to get his doctorate in criminology. And it wasn't long before cops believe he started showing up at the victim's home. Before his arrest, investigators obtained a search warrant for Kohberger's historical cell phone data. And as early as August 21st, his phone pinged a tower covering 1122 King Road. That's more than 2 months before the murders. And on that first night, his phone allegedly was in the area for an hour from about 10:30 to 11:30 p.m. The thought of someone just lurking outside of your home at that time of night on its face value is creepy. But just picture what Kohberger could have seen. There's a parking lot behind the structure attached to a small apartment complex. From there, you could slip out of your car pretty much unnoticed and just watch. That vantage point looks directly into Kaylee's bedroom, into Maddie's bedroom, into the kitchen and the living room. Based on phone records, police believe Kohberger went to the home and watched the house, not once, not twice, but 12 times from late August until November.
Where I'm standing is the vantage point that the alleged killer would have had if he parked back here, which is where the Hyundai was seen and what cops believe happened. And this right here is the foundation to Xana's room. You can still actually see, even after all these weeks, the drips and drops of blood right there that had come out from the foundation. And of course, we now know that Xana was found on the floor of her bedroom, so that would make a lot of sense.
And it seems he didn't just spend time by the house. He is also suspected of loitering around campus. A sophomore at the University of Idaho told a People reporter that they saw Brian at the Student Union. Now, a student at the Student Union is not weird, but remember, Kohberger went to a completely different university. And this sophomore said, quote, "He was the type to stare. He wouldn't look away if you caught him staring, like he wanted you to notice he was looking at you." And another student said that they saw him so often on the University of Idaho campus that they just assumed he was enrolled there. Now, I have been to both the University of Idaho and Washington State University campuses. There is no reason that I can think of to just be hanging out at the other campus unless you are there to meet someone, or what I believe happened in this case was to watch someone. Police seized Kohberger's cell phone at the time of his arrest, as well as a computer tower and a Fire TV stick from his apartment to see if he left any kind of search history showing an interest in or planning of murder, violent assault, stabbing, and or cutting of people, as well as details about the home at 1122 King Road, the surrounding neighborhood, or any of the victims or survivors. They're also hoping that his digital devices will offer up clues as to other locations where evidence like the murder weapon may be found. Connecting Kohberger directly to the knife used in the stabbings will be key for prosecutors. His DNA was already allegedly found on the snap of the knife sheath, according to law enforcement, but that is still not the knife itself, not the murder weapon. The knife used in the slayings had to be obtained from somewhere, and police believe that Kohberger went out and bought it sometime before the crime. Investigators may have found evidence of this already. The search of Kohberger's apartment turned up a Walmart receipt as well as 2 Marshall's receipts. Now, these receipts hold some significance. When cops execute a search warrant, they can only look for a specific list of items pertaining to the crime, and they only seize materials believed to have probative value in the case. Now, to be crystal clear here, we don't know what was on these receipts, what specifically he bought at Walmart, but Walmart does sell fixed blade K-bar knives. And a K-bar knife sheath was left at the crime scene, and the medical examiner confirmed the 4 victims were killed by a fixed blade knife. Brian Kohberger is a unique suspect because he has a long-time academic interest in crimes and criminals. His master's degree is in criminal justice, and he was a criminology PhD student at the time of the murders. So his academic research into the criminal mind goes back years as part of his master's program at DeSales University. Now, there, Kohberger studied under world-renowned Professor Catherine Ramsland, and true crime junkies will no doubt recognize her name. She has done extensive research into the minds of serial killers, specifically her relationship and book on BTK. Kohberger also conducted a research project into convicted criminals, and he asked them a series of survey questions. For a criminal justice researcher, these questions are kind of par for the course, but in light of the crime that he has been accused of, some experts have suggested that Kohberger may have been trying to study the mistakes and the minds of other criminals to create a blueprint for himself. Now, let me show you an example of some of these questions. Now, these are his specific questions. Why did you choose that victim or target over others? What was the first move you made to accomplish your goal? Did you prepare for the crime before leaving your home? Knowledge of the quadruple homicide now makes these questions in retrospect seem sinister and not academic. And I want to point out the usage of the term goal here. We're talking about crimes, sometimes violent crimes, being referred to as a goal, a term most of us consider to be positive. So is that how Brian Koberger views violent crimes, as a goal to achieve? Were these questions a method to weed out mistakes before acting on his own violent impulses? I don't know, and we may never know the answer. The answer might not even matter. There's a good chance that this survey will not make it into trial, so a jury may never hear it. But if a judge does allow it in, the defense may utilize it as a way to plant the seed of reasonable doubt by explaining away all of this research, or any research or Google searches found into violent stabbings, potentially on Koberger's devices, as simply just him doing his schoolwork. It will ultimately be up to a jury to decide whether the suspect is a premeditated murderer or an innocent criminology student. But
yeah, it was pretty crazy. I mean, I was, just like sleeping here on the couch in my parents' house, and I woke up to all these tweets that were like, "Oh, they got the guy." And of course, this has been something that everyone in Pullman has been following, everyone in the whole Pullman Moscow area. And so, I look on my phone and I see the guy's name and I see the picture. And I'm thinking that looks a lot like my TA, who's also named Brian, but that would be crazy. And so I went and I checked my email, to see the emails I'd had with him, and the name matched and everything. And yeah, it was just like totally jarring, totally shocking to realize that this person that had been, kind of grading my papers was, allegedly this like horrible murderer. Yeah, no, entirely. All our interactions came in the form of the class, and not even like, office hours. Like, it was all within the confines of a lecture hall. He was pretty strict as far as grading goes. When he came into class, he was very, not super mentally present. He would stand up at the front, look at the ground. He had a lot of like boilerplate responses he would give people rather than, maybe something he had thought up on the spot. It seemed like he would be, he'd come in knowing what he was going to say to like most interactions. And then when he would grade your papers, he would be grading you on what he ended up calling like a higher standard. But what it really felt like to us was he was grading us like he would have graded himself as a PhD student. And so that was just kind of like, we were all annoyed by him. And so I knew his name, I knew like, oh, TA Brian, like he sucks at this. Like he's grading us too harshly. And that was like an annoyance. But obviously beyond that, we just thought he was a little weird and kind of, a bad grader. Yeah. He actually only left me good comments, which is just kind of silly. Like the only ones I could send in were nice ones, but for most people, he was being pretty harsh in the comments. I just, for whatever reason, he was being pretty good to me. Yeah, actually, we had our professor was big on the idea that like, if we're all going to be attorneys someday, then we have to know how to argue our case. And so he scheduled a day where everyone, came in ready to argue to get their grades up, and he brought in Brian and he was like, all right, go at him. And he had Brian stand up and everyone was, like a few people were on his side because they wanted to keep their high grades and not like have questions be cut out or whatever. But for the most part, it was like, half of a 150-person class just asking him all these real critical questions and he would answer. And he'd actually, he tried pretty hard to defend himself, which was the kind of thing that our professor loved. He wanted the like courtroom environment. And so, so there was just a period of class where we were all sort of arguing about this. Not, I mean, it wasn't like yelling or anything, but it was certainly conflict. Yeah, yeah. We just, it would have been about a month before winter break when like the murders happened. And we didn't obviously build our framework for this around that because we had no reason to connect him to that, at the time. But definitely around then, um, he started grading everybody just hundreds, not like you pretty much if you turned something in, you were getting high marks. And he stopped leaving notes. It was just he seemed preoccupied is what I would have said at the time. And now obviously he seems like he was probably pretty preoccupied. But it was, yeah, it was much easier. You turn in whatever you wanted pretty much, and he was just grading them up and sending them back. Like, Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. He probably that I saw he was always a little bit spotty on whether or not he'd come to class because he had, whatever PhD stuff over the top of it. But the couple times that he did come after or around that time period, I remember him, he had like a little bit more facial hair, just like stubble, but definitely less like well kept than he was. And he was a little quieter. He didn't he used to stand up at the start of class and like talk about some stuff sometimes. And this time he didn't really do that at all. He was definitely, I think, like the previous like mental preoccupation that we had been noticing, where it was like, he didn't really want to be there. That was at like an all-time high, and he just, didn't look like he was doing great.